yeah, it's a pleasure and an honour to be speaking here. So I'm kind of going to give a general overview on the psychology, pharmacology of ayahuasca. And there's kind of a lot of ground to cover. Quite a few scientists have devoted entire careers to this. So a 15-minute window is kind of cutting it a bit fine. But I'm thinking 20 minutes, I might just be able to pull it off. So I'm thinking if you have any questions, please feel free to chase me down any time over today. I'm very, very happy to talk any time. But yeah, I'm sort of going to just go for it and see if I can do it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure people are quite familiar with, from being at the conference, the basic sort of biochemistry, pharmacology, thank you, of the ayahuasca alkaloids. So there's the beta-carboline alkaloids in the Banisterius capi vine, and they are the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and they are pharmacologically active on their own, but they also importantly allow DMT to pass through the lining of the stomach and the intestine and eventually cross the blood-brain barrier where it's active. And this is quite an interesting, unique thing among psychedelic shamanic plants, these two plants working in unison. And it's also interesting to sort of compare our sort of endogenous biochemistry. The brain's chock full of different pharmacologically active compounds and neurotransmitters. So you can see how incredibly similar DMT is to serotonin, one of our key neurotransmitters. And we also, our brain, as I'm sure we all know, also contains low levels of DMT as well. And here sort of melatonin, which plays an ever important role in the brain. It's interesting to compare. This is pinealine. This is kind of our endogenous MAOI compound. And you can see kind of how similar in structure it is to the beta-carbolines. And there's absolutely nothing known about the pharmacological activity of this in humans. There's been absolutely no studies, not a single study. I've contacted a few different pharmacologists, neuroscientists, all leaders in their field, some of them in this room, and they don't even know what's going on with it. So I think it'd be quite good to see some kind of research going on, and I'll slip Amanda maybe a bit of money or something, and we can maybe make something happen here. I think that would be quite good. Okay. So yeah, just a few things looking at the alkaloids in the vine. So, yeah, THH, tetrahydroharmine, which I sort of forgot to mention, that plays a different role. It's not. It's more of a weak serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So, and it seems it might prolong the half-life of DMT, and it's kind of by blocking its intraneuronal uptake. But it's been found to increase sort of the serotonin transporters on platelets. And this is kind of a long-term-ish thing, lasting a few weeks after a single dose, and then it gradually returns to baseline. And these transporters are the same sites that a lot of pharmaceutical antidepressants, like the SSRIs, which are currently in vogue, unfortunately, they are the same sites that they target. So that's an interesting thing with regards sort of antidepressive effects. And an interesting thing, at least in animal models, harmine, one of the alkaloids, has been implicated in neurogenesis as well as antidepressant effects, at least in rats. And this neurogenesis is kind of a cutting-edge frontier of research right now. So psilocybin, ibogaine, ketamine, and ayahuasca in terms of harmine have all been implicated with increasing neurogenesis and possibly increasing glutamate, which is also linked to neurogenesis and enhancing in neuroplasticity. They also happen to be some of the most potent antidepressants that nature or lab has to offer. And this might not be such a coincidence. And it's an interesting thing to note compared to the way we approach depression now with these pharmaceutical drugs like SSRIs. They only sort of treat the symptoms and numb the edges, and they require daily use, and the withdrawals are horrific. I think we can be doing a lot better with depression and the treatment. So it's interesting that there's maybe hope on the horizon with some of these compounds. So yeah, just kind of a brief summary of what's going on in the brain. I can't go into that much detail because it turns out brains are quite complex and there's lots of stuff going on with them. So there's a few key areas that that ayahuasca seems to target. So it's the highly evolved neocortex part of the brain, and this is our most recently evolved, acquired part of our brain that separates us from the other monkeys and is kind of responsible, I guess, for our greatest achievements and greatest failings as a species. And there's a lot of these 5-HT2A receptors in there, in that part of the brain, and this is where DMT binds to. And so that part of the brain plays roles in sort of abstract thinking and planning and perception and reasoning. And then also the amygdala, and this sort of acts as a storehouse for emotional memories, particularly traumatic or significant emotional memories. So it tends to be overactive in post-traumatic stress disorder. And then also the insular cortex, which you can see down there, and that plays a role sort of bridging emotional impulses and decision-making capacity. In these areas in particular, ayahuasca works on. So yeah, the brainwave effects of ayahuasca are interesting, and it's not a very consistent the findings aren't so consistent. It varies between synchronization and desynchronization depending on the study. Obviously, there's going to be a difference between looking at people in a lab and an MRI and sort of in field conditions. Some studies are finding increases of alpha and theta waves in the occipital and frontal lobes. Other data is finding, and these alpha and theta states, interestingly, they kind of correlate more to effects of meditation than they do to other psychedelics, like LSD, mescaline, or psilocybin. So it seems the ayahuasca state has some parallels, but is more intense than a meditative state. Now, some studies, interestingly, have found some increases in high-frequency gamma waves and synchronization in the brain. And these gamma waves are very high-frequency brain waves, and they've been implicated in, highly experienced Buddhist monks produce a lot of gamma waves in meditation. Lucid dreamers, very recently been found when you're lucid dreaming, you have these high-frequency gamma waves. And yeah, interestingly, there was a study on rats, and it was looking at what happens to the brain during physical death. And in these rats, it was noted that there was a high level of synchronization between parts of the brain and this very high frequency gamma wave emission in the brain, which is interesting. Like, the brain doesn't go out with a whimper in that context. It seems to go out with a high frequency bioelectrical bang. And like, on that note, just out of interest, just for a show of hands, like, how many people here with ayahuasca have felt that they had died or were dying during an ayahuasca experience? Yeah, quite a few people, which is interesting. So yeah, like an interesting, sort of fairly recent study looking at sort of the perception of ayahuasca visions in the brain, and it seems some parallels with dreaming and lucid dreaming, actually. Like, it's not a vague imaginatory form that the visions take in the brain. If you're looking at the brain, it's as active almost as if it's perceiving reality as it is now. So there's kind of a tangible neurological base for these visions. So yeah, I thought it might be briefly interesting just to look at compare sort of the ayahuasca brain state with those from sort of psychedelics and other sort of meditational states. And yeah, as I said before, the ayahuasca state is distinct from other psychedelics in some ways. With long-term meditation, it's the default mode network. The medial prefrontal, posterior cingulate cortex are deactivated, and that goes across all meditation types, which is interesting. It seems like it's the default mode network that ayahuasca also works on, as well as psilocybin and other psychedelics. So there's also changes to the insula and grey matter sort of density in the left hippocampus, posterior cingulate cortex in in meditation as well, areas that ayahuasca also impacts, which is interesting. So long-term, in terms of long-term ayahuasca studies, there's been some interesting research by Jordi Rebus and recent published research, and that's found changes in the default mode network and some thickening and thinning in different areas of the cingulate cortex. And these neural adaptations that follow this long-term ayahuasca assumptions, they've been linked to self-transcendence, which again is linked to the personality domain of openness, which is also affected in the long term by psilocybin. So there's some parallels there between them. And it might be as an interesting research thing, like there's been studies of long-term meditational research and ayahuasca research. It might be interesting to look at the combination of meditational techniques with ayahuasca drinking. Like there's this capacity, it seems, to re-sculpt, remold the brain, which is fascinating. And maybe quite an empowering thing, and it sort of deserves to be, the implications should be explored, I think. So one of the, I guess, key studies, the Ayahuasca project, looking at UDV members, was one of the sort of key scientific studies that sort of kicked off the scientific research into ayahuasca, and I guess is partly why we're sort of here today. And it looked at 15 members of the UDV, and it was interesting to sort of, it did a range of different tests. So on some of these tests, such as memory concentration tests, the UDV, the ayahuasca drinkers, did better than sober controls, which is interesting. But of these 15 UDV members, before joining, like 11 had alcohol misuse problems, 5 of them with violence, 5 of them had drug problems, 11 had tobacco addiction, and a few had psychiatric problems. And all of them, following UDV membership and long-term ayahuasca consumption, had full remission of all symptoms and felt physical and mental benefits from their use of ayahuasca. So yeah, it's interesting to look at just the ayahuasca is a very multifaceted agent, and it's interesting to sort of look at its effects on depression in particular. So there's this ability of ayahuasca, as I'm sure we all know, to experimentally approach the foundational causes, the roots of issues, and examine them in great depth, and sort of work towards a cathartic solution to those. It also hyperactivates brain regions responsible for long forgotten repressed memories, and it allows the conscious part of the brain to kind of override these areas and form new connections and enhance neuroplasticity, which is important. Then you've got this increase in serotonin receptor sites, an increase in neurogenesis, and then you've got the whole doing it in a ritualized supportive setting is a very important part of the healing aspect as well. So yeah, there's been a range of, it's a very much a cutting, you can see these studies are very recent. There's ongoing addiction research, which is very promising. Saw an amazing film yesterday here called The Jungle Prescription, looking at Dr. Gabor Mate's amazing work in British Columbia with addiction, and he integrates ayahuasca treatment. He went to the Tacahuasi Center in Peru, which is an actively sort of assisting addicts and other people with issues, and he works with addicts and people suffering from trauma, and uses psychotherapy with ayahuasca sessions, and the results are very, very interesting. And yeah, it's this, again, multifaceted approach of the neurobiological and psychological processes combined, and this, you know, this is far superior and deeper than any pharmaceutical or antidepressant that we sort of have. It's yeah. And then there's this interesting facet of ayahuasca to be able to potentially improve healthy people, to make like normal people better through like ratings of mindfulness and outlook, empowerment, hopefulness, fulfillment of life. These ratings tend to go up with ayahuasca, particularly again if it's drank in a ritualized supportive setting. I don't think this needs to be in a religious setting as such, but I think the ritualized supportive setting is very important. And yeah, just to end, this is a nice quote that this is what ayahuasca told Dennis McKenna, and I think this sort of fits the personality of ayahuasca quite well. I think ayahuasca's it's very good at humbling human beings, and I think that's something we could all do with a lot more. We sort of, I don't know what it is, but we've maybe Judeo-Christian hangover. We're kind of living out of balance with nature, and I think ayahuasca and these other psychedelics can really put us back in touch with the pulsing heart of nature, and I think that's very important. And it's great to see there's lots of active research now, like Jordi Rebra. I was speaking to him. He's going to be doing more neuroimaging, neurochemical work on ayahuasca. There's research going on at the Takiwazi Center. Dennis McKenna is planning to do some research in Peru on addiction and trauma out there, and get data there because it's really hard in the States, which is great. And the ayahuasca outcome treatment project is ongoing as well, looking at similar things. So it's great seeing ayahuasca being used to help and assist people. Thank you.